Good evening, my fellow Americans. Tonight I want to talk to you on a subject of deep concern to all Americans and to many people in all parts of the world, the war in Vietnam. I would like to answer some of the questions that I know are on the minds of many of you listening to me. How and why did America get involved in Vietnam in the first place?
We were like 21, 22, 23 years old. We were kids. We were people who'd come up in activism. We were born in the civil rights movement. We were then born in the anti-war movement. We were born in the women's movement and in the beginning of the queer movement. So all this ferment was happening. And one principle was look to the most oppressed.
The combination of the word black and power shocked the nation. I mean, white people went nuts. You know, they just went nuts.
With the last words on my lips that I am a revolutionary, and you're gonna have to keep on saying that.
When Fred Hampton was murdered, even though I was incarcerated at the time, I knew immediately that Fred did not die at the hands of the police officers with the guns who invaded his home. That was set up. And later it was proven that it was set up.
We've got to be out there and not just applauding from the sidelines. But we identified that as being racist, to not take any of the costs.
I was convinced that these guns were not loaded with live ammo. I thought, how ridiculous would that be? Until I saw the ground in front of me churn up, and I realized at that moment that they were live bullets. I was also shot at that point.
So we came out of the trailer a little bit early so you can actually talk to the author. Now think about it. Protests, vitriolic political rhetoric, and the U.S. military stuck in long-running international conflicts. Well, if it seems as if we're unraveling at the seams, you may take some comfort in knowing that it's not for the first time. The late 1960s and early 70s were also marked by great unrest, and a new book documents that era's baby boomer upheaval and helps contextualize millennial movements like Black Lives Matter or Occupy Wall Street.
That's right, and the book's author is a veteran writer who's been at the forefront of social commentary on everything from gender equity to the environment. Clara Bingham, the author of Witness to the Revolution, Radicals, Resistors, Vets, Hippies, and the Year America Lost Its Mind and Found Its Soul. It's right there in print. Welcome to BK Live.
Thanks for having me, and you even got that subtitle right, which is not easy.
It all matters.
No, it's clearly all matters, and it's all in there. It's amazing, amazing book. So just I want to say congratulations on having it published and having your voice put out there. Can you tell us a little bit about why it was so important to focus on this specific time period?
I realized that what was going on now politically with all of the movements, Black Lives Matter, Occupy Wall Street, MoveOn.org, and even before that, that it had a precursor, that we needed to know what the history really was of all of these important political and social movements, and that the 60s had been sort of misunderstood, glamorized, criticized, and that it was a good time to look back now while the participants are getting older and interview as many as I could to kind of recreate and try to make sense of the 60s, because I think that the more we know about the 60s, the more we'll be able to understand about where we are now.
Now, for those of you who are just like watching this and see how thick this thing is, I'm looking at about what, Clara, like 600 pages. Plus. But the thing is, there are moments when the culture sort of rises to meet the work that you've done. And this didn't just happen because Black Lives Matter became a hashtag. You'd been doing the work, and we're really at the apex of a lot of the same issues here.
Yeah, and actually I did all of this, but a lot of it before even Black Lives Matter was a hashtag.
So who do you think is the beneficiary of all of the wealth of knowledge and just craziness that happened in this period from 69 to 70?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think we are women and Black people. Yeah. Let's face it. In the 50s, we had no rights, and even in the early 60s. And so what's interesting about the late 60s is it was a perfect storm of rebellion. It was when the civil rights movement had been bubbling up over the course of the 60s. The counterculture had been bubbling up, and then the Vietnam War hit in 1965 and exploded. And by the late 60s, you know, the Black Power movement, the feminist movement, the gay rights movement, movement, the environmental movement, all sprung out of this massive rebellion that took place. And I think it was really as close as we've ever come to a civil war since the 1860s. We forget, I mean, those numbers in the trailer, the student strike in May after we invaded Cambodia and 4 students were killed.
People showing up.
2.5 million students went on strike.
How many schools were shut down?
700
schools were shut down. It's absolutely amazing, and well, to put it bluntly, it was sort of a wake-up call, because so many times we sort of think we're familiarize ourselves with these concepts, but then to have an in-depth oral history just laid out for you the way you did. So many times people write a book, but to go actually into, how many interviews did you do? 100?
I interviewed 100 people.
Okay, so this book is sort of a compendium of 100 different voices talking about their individual lives, and when you read it, it's it's broken up in just a small paragraph, so it's like you're really sort of in that time, in that space with that person in a way most books don't allow you to be.
That's what I was really hoping for by writing an oral history narrative. I just let the people talk about their personal experiences. I didn't talk to pundits. I only talked to people who were in the room. Some were famous, many were not, but they all had very powerful personal experiences. Many of them were traumatized by it. And so I wanted the book to be emotionally authentic. And even though it might not be a perfect history of exactly what happened chronologically, it's really an emotional experience to read the book too. I'm glad that you felt that way.
Well, in just picking the 100 folks, there, in the way that Aaron was hinting at, all of the sort of stories are interwoven in a way that creates an arc that's very easy to follow. And you talk to Jane Fonda and Oliver Stone and Bernstein. There's lots of names that you'll recognize, and there's also people who, by rights, I don't know, would have been lost to history. I wondered if there was, in all those 100, sort of through line, anything that unified all of those disparate stories, whether they're talking about women's equality or civil rights or the nascent gay liberation, if there was a through line that may have connected all of those people?
Well, I thought the anti-war movement, the Vietnam War and the opposition to it really was at the core of the book, and that all the other movements came out of that, and so I used all the events that were all in opposition to the war, the moratorium, Kent State, My Lai, all of these events were really in reaction to the war itself, and how all these different people from different parts of the country reacted to it. I spent a lot of time on rock and roll and drugs, and people who were drug dealers who felt that they were opposing the war as well.
You even included the memories of the son of the judge that presided over the Panther 21.
Judge Murtagh's son, who the Weather Underground bombed their house during the Panther 21 trial, and what it was like for him as a kid to wake up in the middle of the night to a firebomb in his front yard.
So I asked you who the beneficiaries are earlier, but I'm wondering, everything was so radical. There was bombs exploding, kids being shot on campuses, students walking out of school. I wondered if the next generation got a little shell-shocked and even complacent that we're seeing now. It went from people using their lives to hashtag sort of activism.
Yeah, well, I mean, imagine if there was hashtags back then.
Yeah.
I mean, I think if there was the internet, it would have been 5 times bigger. But it's important to remember that back then we had the draft. And that the draft itself politicized an entire generation. 27 million men were of draft age between 1965 and 1973. And that alone had a massive impact on this general rebellion against the establishment. Once you decided you were going to fight the draft, or you were going to go to jail for it, run to Canada for it, that meant you were sort of blowing up everything in your life. You were giving up your education. You decided not to go work for a corporation. It sort of became this general rebellion that spread into every other part of society.
Who's still fighting this war? Who is still in their minds in the 1969? Because I've met 1 or 2 of those guys who are still here.
Well, there is Bernie Sanders.
Okay.
Bernie Sanders was an ex-hippie from Vermont. He moved to Vermont when everyone was moving there for the communes. and I'd say all the young burners are now, right now, trying to fight a revolution, as they call it, for the political issues that did not get passed in the 60s.
Yeah.
You know, they really failed. A lot of the people will tell you in my book that they failed politically. They really did win the wars culturally and socially, but they did not win the political wars.
Yeah. Well, we're out of time.
Yeah.
But please, please, please go pick this book
It
up.
may not look like summer reading, but people stopped me on the train when I was reading it Friday, getting ready for
No,
the
it's a
day,
really
but,
easy read,
yeah.
and you can pick it down, put it up anytime, and it's absolutely amazing. I loved it. So.
Oh, thank you so
Clara
much.
Bingham, Witness to the Revolution, is available right now.
Radicals, resistors, vets, hippies, in the year America lost its mind and found its soul.
They're all in there.